Hello, everyone. It's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and I'm joined today by Tomer. What's up, Tomer?
Hey Seth, how's it going, man?
Doing well, ready to talk some more Commander 2016 as our previews continue. Today we have a sweet deck. We are looking at Stalwart Unity, one of the more unique playstyles, I think, out of all the decks in the Commander 2016 release. So, like we have on the other days, Tomer, do you want to take a minute and just break down what this deck's about and what kind of player might want to pick it up and try it out in person?
All right. Well, you're looking at all the pre-constructed decks. You see Stalwart Unity. You're wondering, what is this about and why should I pick it? Well, this is the most defensive of the decks, the most dirtly of the decks, and I would say the most political of all the decks as well. So if you want to be a very aggressive deck and you want to focus mostly on synergies and very specific themes, you probably want to avoid Stalwart Unity. However, if you want to focus on political aspects, using your opponents to do your bidding, either directly or indirectly, then Stalwart Unity is probably the one for you. Basically, this deck is a lot about pillow forting, making it very difficult for your opponents to attack you, and also giving your opponents a lot of incentive not to mess with you. You have cards like Edric, Spymaster Trust, one of my favorite cards in the game, that says your opponents, well, everybody draws cards as long as they attack people who aren't you. So they're very incentivized to attack other people. So they have a lot of these different effects, and then you have some haymakers to actually close out the game. You have like Rebel Hulk and Psychosis Crawler to do a lot of damage out of nowhere and steal the game. You also have a lot of Group Hug in this deck as well. The general itself that we'll talk about is Group Hug, and we have a lot of abilities over here like the collective cards that let everybody draw cards together or let everybody ramp cards together, Howling Mine that lets everybody draw cards as well. And these are all incentives to not only help your opponents because you're a nice guy, but also incentivizes them not to bother with you because you're helping them out. So it's a very, very political deck. And that if you are looking for that style of play, which is very unique to multiplayer formats, then you want to pick up Stalwart Unity.
Yeah, I think this might be one of the more challenging decks for new players, just because it's a really unique strategy. Like you said, pillforting up, kind of somewhat benefiting your opponent with a lot of your cards, as well as benefiting you. You have a lot of symmetrical effects, things that kind of help both players. So I think this is one of the more fun decks as far as I'm concerned. I would enjoy playing this deck, but I think it will be a challenge if you have never played this style of deck before. You're not just going to jam a bunch of creatures and go attacking and kill your opponent. It's a lot more nuanced than that and going to take some practice, I think, to really understand how the deck's working if you've never played a kind of a pillow fort style or group hug style of deck before.
Absolutely. And also, if you're moving from a one versus one traditional format like standard or modern or even legacy, transitioning to this and trying to look at the strength of these cards, most of them look really bad in a dual scenario. However, there's a lot of subtle power to these, and that's where the politics comes in. And we'll talk about some of the new cards and show off the political power of them. But transitioning from a one versus one game format to a multiplayer one where suddenly there's politics where there wasn't, it's going to be hard for people to understand, at least at first, why politics is so important in multiplayer. But the more you play, the more politics becomes apparent.
All right, let's move on to the individual cards. And first off, we have the four-color commander from the deck, Kynaios and Tiro of Meletis. So, Tomer, is this the best group hug commander outside of maybe Feldegriff? Is this right at the top of the group hug list?
I think it is. Personally, it is my favorite group hug general, mostly because I don't enjoy pure group hug. I don't like I don't like helping all my opponents out just for the sake of it to see what happens, to be a nice guy. I always want to get a little bit extra out of the deal, be it alliances or favors that I can call out. But this one, and I'm going to butcher it again, Kynaios and Tiro, they actually, it's not a symmetrical effect. It's actually an asymmetrical effect because it helps you a little bit more. You're going to draw a card, and at the end of your, everybody's going to either draw, your opponents are, your opponents are either going to put a land or draw a card. However, you are going to draw a card, and then you might also play a land as well. So your opponents get one or the other one. You potentially get both. So it's actually helping you more than it's helping your opponents. And that's the style of group hug that I like. People are going to like you because you're drawing them cards, but you're going to get even more out of the bargain for it. So that's why I really like group hug so much, this style of group hug so much. And the fact that they have access to 4 colors means you just have more variety available to you.
Yeah, I think this one is very good. It is also near the top of my group hug commander list, and I think this is the kind of card that sneaks up on opponents. It doesn't look really powerful. It's a two-way. It's not really threatening. It's allowing your opponents to get some value out of it, either ramping or drawing a card. But you're right. Every turn cycle, when this triggers, you're getting double the advantage of each of your opponents, theoretically, assuming you have a land in hand and all that stuff. But in general, you're getting twice as much advantage. So I could imagine that after 5 or 10 turns, your opponents look back and they're like, wow, that really just won the game for you. All those extra land drops you were making, all the extra draws you were taking, when it doesn't actually look that powerful or feel that bad on the battlefield. So your opponents probably aren't going to paint a target on it and try to kill it right away like they would with some other commanders. So I think it's sneakily powerful and a really unique and fun effect.
Yeah, I absolutely agree about the subtlety of the power. Like, you're going to get ahead of your opponents, and your opponents won't even realize it until you've developed this huge board state. And they'll be wondering, where did all this ramp come? Where did all this card draw come?
So we've been talking Commander 2016 for days, and I've been waiting to get to this card because I wanna hear your hot take, Tomer. This is a card that sent the community into an uproar. People hate it. People were so mad. I've never seen people so mad about a card from a supplemental product. Ludwig, Necro, Alchemist, Tomer, what's your take on the 1/4?
I mean, I'm going to beat the dead horse at this point. Obviously, this guy's not going to resurrect it because the mechanics are just not there. But this is the zombie guy. He's supposed, in his threat, he's like one of the most powerful Necro Alchemists. Like, there was Gisa and Geralf, or Gisa and Geralf, and Geralf was a Necro Alchemist who looked up to this guy. He was like he became his apprentice because he was like so wowed by him. And then you look at the actual mechanics here, and where's the animation? Where's the necromancy? It's not even the right colors. Like, come on. What did they do? They clearly designed the card first, and then they were like, well, let's throw a random name on it. Oh, we haven't given a Ludwig card yet, so okay, we'll just name this guy Ludwig without any consideration to the lore implications. So that sucks. As a Vorfits person, that's like a slap in the face. As a card by itself, it's also very kind of underwhelming. It is a political card because at the beginning of each player's end step, that player may draw a card if a player other than you lost life this turn. So it incentivizes each person on their turn to make at least one of your opponents lose life. They can also deal damage to you at the same time, but the primary thing is that they have to deal damage to an opponent, one of your opponents, to gain that card. So it's kind of like Edric. It's kind of like a bad Edric, honestly, and I don't really like him. How about you, Seth?
I mean, I like drawing cards, but I still am not a fan of this card. The Vorthos problem is major. The abilities aren't really exciting. Just all around, this is not a card that really appeals that much to me, which is amazing considering it allows you to draw cards. So the bar on Magic cards that say draw a card is incredibly low, so the fact that I don't like this card really says something. I have one more question for you, though, Tomer. So you obviously don't like the flavor and Vorthos aspect. how much does that tie into your deck building? Would you not put this in a deck because you are so pissed off about the Vorthos fail of the card? Does that seep into your actual gameplay, or are those two separate issues?
It's definitely a factor. However, if Ludovic was actually a really good card, then there is a tipping point where I'd be like, you know what, he's so good, and he works mechanically that I'm going to run him anyway, even though he's a huge flavor fail and a disappointment each time you draw him. But he's also just he's not a bad card. He does fit the deck's overall theme, Stalwart Unity's overall theme of incentivizing your opponents to attack people who aren't you. So he fits that. He just doesn't do a very good job of it. Because it's a flavor fail and because it's not a particularly strong card, I don't see myself ever running him outside of the pre-constructed list.
All right, moving on to our next partnered commander. We have Sidar Kondo of Gemara. So, Tomer, flanking is back. What do you think of the Human Knight?
I feel like a lot of people are going to make wrong blocks because they'll be like, flanking? What's flanking? Oh, it does that? Oh, I probably shouldn't have blocked that way then. And then they're going to forget again and again because when was the last time we saw flanking? And it's just one card. But I think it's funny because I remember flanking cards kind of a little bit. So I'm going to enjoy that aspect of him. And then the other ability, creatures your opponents control without flying or reach, can't block creatures with power 2 or less. It does incentivize playing your weenie cards, which Stalwart Unity and these type of group hug decks often have. They have just weenie utility creatures. Now they can get in for damage, at least if their opponent doesn't have flyers or reach. And it also incentivizes your opponents to do the same thing too, because this ability is global. It helps all your opponents get in their evasive creatures. So it is group huggy in a way. It's also political because it only affects your opponents. So again, it does a good job incentivizing your opponents to attack each other instead of you. So I like it. It's four mana for this ability is pretty good. I don't think he's like an amazing card, but I think he's a solid one, and he's a good partner. Like, I think he can partner up with another commander that probably has 2 power or less and has a good combat trigger, like Silas, for example.
Yeah, I think it's a fine card. It's probably in the middle of the pack as far as the partnered commanders go for me. I think that probably the big deal is it does incentivize your opponents to attack each other, so it does kind of work not like a real ghostly prison effect, but it does make it less likely that you're going to be getting attacked, which is kind of what a group hug deck is looking for, to kind of pillow fort up like that. So I like that it does that. Plus, it does give you kind of a backup way of winning the game by getting in some creature damage. So I think it's fine. I don't know what type of deck, apart from like flanking Knight Tribal or something, if I was going to go really in on the flavor, I don't know what type of deck I would use this as the solo commander of, but I think it's a pretty reasonable card, and it'll be interesting to see a new generation of Magic players get blown out by flanking, as you mentioned.
Absolutely. I think if I was going super hardcore on flavor, I'd probably put him. I don't know who I'd part him with, but I'd put him on top of like a Weatherlight Saga deck because he is the father of Gerard, so maybe there's something to do there. But yeah, it's tough to go really deep on him. He's not exceptionally good, but there is some subtle power, at least incentivizing your opponents to take advantage of that ability as well. So that's kind of nice.
All right, our last partnered commander, we have Kuru Ludwig's Opus. Is this as bad as Ludwig himself, Tomer?
No, it's not that bad. At least it's Crom and it's a zombie, so they got that part right. It's not in black, so that's kind of odd for a zombie card, but it's not the worst. And its ability is actually pretty decent. Your opponents are generally going to want to cast more than one spell each turn. That doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. Sometimes you're going to draw more than one. Sometimes you're going to draw 1 card a turn. Sometimes you're not going to draw any at all. Sometimes you're going to draw maybe 3 cards a turn. It's not awful. It's a flying with haste, and it's a 4/4, so it deals decent damage. And it has some interesting partner implications, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. And I think we've seen enough situations with Ristic studies. And what's the card you always play and get yelled at for, Tomer?
Mystic Remora.
The Mystic Remora. We've seen enough situations with those cards on the battlefield where you're going to have people that are going to play more than one spell in a turn. And this is a big one. This is, you kind of have to do that. If you make your opponent only play one spell each turn, you're kind of winning anyway. And if your opponent's casting multiple spells in a turn, you're drawing a card, so you're coming out ahead. Plus, a 4/4 flying haste for 5 mana isn't a horrible body. I'm kind of surprised because a lot of the partnered commanders, their bodies just aren't that big, but a 4/4 flying haste for 5 is a pretty reasonable creature. That's like a Stormbreath dragon on its own. So I think this is one of the better partnered commanders. Definitely the best one from this deck that we're talking about. So
Oh yeah, I certainly agree. And the fact that it is a zombie means you could put it in a zombie deck. I'm personally going to be trying it out in my Thraxamundar tribal zombie deck because it is access to blue and red. So might as well give it a shot and see how it goes.
it's also worth noting it is a horror as well, and we've seen support with from like Thing in the Ice. Their blue-red horror has kind of been a thing recently with standard cards. So this could be a general for a blue-red horror deck, which would be something I think maybe completely new to Commander that we just haven't had before.
For sure. Especially if you partner it with something that has black, a partner with black, then you get access to pretty much all the horrors in the game.
All right, let's move on to the cards that might find a home in the 99. Up next, we have a really odd fog. I don't know what to make of this card, Tomer. Is this a fog? Is this a card draw spell?
It's definitely a combat trick, and I think of it as a card draw spell. Actually, yes. The way I see it is, let's say you are attacking Richard, and you have a bunch of creatures that you're attacking with, and Richard was unprepared. He is tapped down for whatever reason. I say, hey, Richard, I can untap all your creatures, and you can blow out Seth, or you can just die to Seth's army, whichever you choose. And he'll probably say, yeah, okay, I'll probably block. I don't want to lose. And so you cast Benefactor's Draught for 2 mana. You immediately draw a card anyway. And then Richard blocks with like 4 or so creatures, and he survives, and you made a temporary ally. You get blown out south, I'm sorry. And then you draw like 5 cards out of it for 2 mana while making an alliance at the same time. That's how I think it's going to pan out sometimes. That's probably an ideal situation. But you can also use it defensively for yourself as well. You're not going to be drawing any cards off it. But if you are being attacked and you are tapped down, then you can use this ability to untap all your creatures. You still draw a card, so that's not the worst. And it's a pretty decent combat trick, I think.
So this one still just am having a hard time grasping how this is going to play out in an actual game of Commander, which I think is what's confusing me. So as far as power level, Tomer, is this something that will end up in your decks?
It will end up in some of my decks, but it's definitely on the more casual side, I would say. I don't think this is something you can always depend on. It has very high variance. It always cantrips, so that's fine. But it does have some chances to be a real blowout, either for you or by helping somebody else and you drawing cards in the process.
Oh, fair enough. Well, moving on, we have a weird removal spell, Entrapment Maneuver. Target player sacks an attacking creature. You get some soldier tokens where X was that creature's toughness. Let me hear you go first on this one, Tomer. What do you think?
I really liked it at first, but it's a little bit more selective than I thought it would be. 4 mana for a combat trick is pretty expensive. That's a lot of mana that you have to keep held up in case you do need to sacrifice an attacking creature. Also, the player gets to choose which attacking creature does get sacrificed. So if it's attacking with like 4 or so, it's going to sacrifice the least important one. Not usually like the 8/8 Trampler that you were hoping would be sacrificed. It's going to be probably like the 1/1 Saproling instead. So that makes it a little bit more selective. However, it is a huge blowout if your opponent is playing, for example, Voltron and just focusing on a couple giant threats. This is going to be an enormous blowout potential. I think it's really good for defensive decks and decks that are token decks, because it does generate creature tokens, and I think that's like the main benefit of it. That's why you're paying that much mana for a combat trick. But I think, yeah, if you're not playing a tokens deck, if you're not taking advantage of the tokens in particular, I think there are better options.
Yeah. Oh man, this one is so high variance. My initial thinking was it was just straight up bad, but I mean, there are scenarios where it's going to be absolutely absurd. So I think the floor on this card is 4 mana, you kill a relatively meaningless creature and get a 1/1, which. That's pretty horrible. On the other hand, the ceiling is, and it's important to realize the way the timing works, your opponent attacks, on their declare attack phase, you cast this, you get all those tokens in time to block with them. So if your opponent is in a scenario where they're only attacking with relatively big creatures, this can sort of play like a fog where you are going to at least get a bunch of chump blockers, and at best, your opponent sacks something, you get all these tokens, you 2 or 3 for 1 your opponent by immediately blocking with those tokens, almost like the spider fog card that we saw from the last Commander edition.
Yeah.
So I think that it's just super high variance, and I don't even know how to judge this card. I think it's another one of those cards that's going to come down to your play group and what style of decks people play. I would not have any interest in playing this against token decks or even decks that are like Edric, for example, that are often attacking with a bunch of little creatures. This isn't worth it. On the other hand, in certain play groups and metas, I think this card could be incredibly powerful and maybe even game swinging.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. It really depends on your personal metagame. If you have at least one opponent that you know is going to be running with big creatures and not going wide and just go tall, then this is really good. I think that the card would have been a lot better and more playable if it just cost 3 mana instead of 4. 4 mana is just a lot of mana to hold up at any time to use it. But it's not the worst, and I personally will be using it in my tokens decks just to see how it plays out. But yeah.
Well, let's move on to a mana rock, a pretty potentially crazy mana rock. What do you think of Prismatic Geoscope, Tomer?
Well, there's only one other mana rock that taps for mana at the 5 converted mana cost end that is really comparable, and that's Gilded Lotus. Gilded Lotus is 5 mana artifact, and it doesn't come into play tapped, and you can tap it for 3 mana of any color. But it all has to be the same color, so it can be like red, 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 or blue, blue, blue. So Prismatic Geoscope, I think, actually compares very favorably to it. It obviously comes into play battlefield tapped, so you can't use it the turn it comes out. However, you can potentially make more mana with it. If you're in a 4-color deck, or if you're in a 5-color deck, you can tap for 4 or 5 mana, and it should do so pretty regularly if you design your mana base correctly. So I think the ceiling is much higher for the same mana cost, and I think it's superior in 4 and 5 color decks.
So, yeah, this one is really interesting to me because it's pretty alluring to be able to go from turn 5 having 5 mana to turn 6 having 11 mana. That's a massive jump, plus the huge color fixing ability. It really is limited, though, in the kind of decks you can play it in. I think if you're playing 2-color decks or mono-color decks, I wouldn't even really consider this. Once you get to 3 colors and you're tapping for 3, then I think you're still better off with Gilded Lotus in most scenarios, but it's pretty comparable thanks to the mana, the ability to split up the mana and kind of fix mana better with Prismatic Geoscope. However, once you get to 4 or 5 color decks, this is a really powerful mana rock, and I think it will be a borderline staple in decks that are playing 4 or 5 colors.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that in 4 or 5 color decks, especially if you have more money to upgrade your mana base, it gets better and better. Because if you're doing a 4 color or 5 color mana base on an extreme budget, you can't really afford the dual lands that count as 2 basic land types. For example, the shock lands from Ravnica, or the original dual lands from Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited, or even the new ones from Battle for Zendikar. But you'd probably be stuck with like the tri lands and stuff that don't count as basic lands, and you might not always get full value, at least originally, from the Geoscope when you cast it. However, the better your mana base is, the more fetch lands you can run, the more dual lands you can run, and you can effortlessly get 4 or 5 basic land types on the battlefield to immediately use the Geoscope for maximum value. So I think in 4 and 5 color decks, as you said, it's definitely a staple.
And that's definitely a good point too. If you're building with this card in your deck, be aware of that with your mana base. It does care about basic land type. So it's not just the colors of lands that you have. If you have all non-basic lands on your battlefield, this is going to tap for 0 mana. So be aware of that as you play with the card and construct that into your deck. Plus, be aware of it in gameplay, and if you have a prismatic geoscope in your hand, you might want to focus on getting those basic land types over getting dual lands with, I don't know, Expedition Map or Sylvan Scrying or something like that. So moving on, we have Seeds of Renewal, another one of the Undaunted cards. Tomer, what do you think of this one?
All right, so if we're assuming that it's a 4-player free-for-all game, you have 3 opponents available to you right now, so that the Undaunted cost is -3, and you're paying, what, 4 mana for it?
Yep.
Yeah, 4 mana for it. Then it's essentially a cheaper version of Restock, which also returns 2 cards from your graveyard to your hand, and you exile it. And it costs 5 mana, and actually costs 2 green, so it's a little bit harder to cast. So compared to that, Seeds of Renewal is actually quite good once you actually have 3 opponents up that you're up against. I don't personally play Restock that often. I usually run Regrowth or Eternal Witness. However, it's still a good card, and I've seen it been used to good effect. Seeds of Renewal for 4 mana, however, I think I can see myself actually playing it.
Yeah, I mean, that 1 mana discount is actually pretty good. Being just 1 more mana than Eternal Witness makes it seem like a pretty good deal. Of course, you don't get the body and the ability to blink or reanimate it, but still, 4 mana get back 2 cards is a really good deal. It does, of course, scale poorly in the late game as people start dying, but I think this is a pretty reasonable card, and I mean, if you want the effect and you're playing Commander, it's about as good as it gets for what it does, getting 2 cards back from your graveyard.
Yeah, I think just the fact that it's a little bit cheaper than the non-variant version, which is Restock, makes it definitely playable. I don't like Restock that much, but it's still a very solid card, and making it just 1 mana less on average, or at least at the middle, early to mid game, I think it's definitely playable. It's something I'm going to have to tinker with.
And it's interesting with this one because when we were talking about the white Undaunted card, which is a Wrath, which ended up at full power costing 4 mana, we were saying, well, it's the same as a Day of Judgment or Wrath of God, so you're not really getting a discount. With Seeds of Renewal, you are getting a discount over what that effect normally costs, which I think is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I think that was intentional as well when the design. I think maybe the designers thought that Restock was a little bit underpowered, at least for EDH, so they decided to make this Undaunted version 1 cheaper. But when they were doing the board wipe, they decided that Day of Judgment is actually very good and sought after as a staple 4 mana board wipe in EDH, very playable. So they decided to just match it instead. But I'm very happy that they decided to make this one a little bit cheaper because that makes it all the more enticing for me.
Well, let's move on to the last card from our Commander preview today. We have another 4 mana white card, essentially an instant, a creature with flash, Selfless Squire. Another unique effect. Tomer, what do you think about this one?
All right, so when it was first spoiled, I was a little bit down on this card. I thought 4 mana for essentially a fog effect and a slightly big creature, it's not that exciting. I also just don't like holding up that much mana in most decks. But as was pointed out to me, there's a lot more going on with Selfless Squire. The most important thing is blink effects or bounce effects allow you to use its enter the battlefield ability more and more often. And you could have an engine going on where you're just bouncing it back to your hand with like Conjurer's Closet or something, and just keep on having a repeatable fog effect and making it very difficult for your opponents to ever deal with you.
Yeah, Also important to note when it comes to evaluating fogs, this one just says prevent all damage that would be dealt to you this turn. So unlike some fog effects, it doesn't care about creature damage or anything like that. So if your opponent is throwing a big X burn spell at your face to kill you, Selfless Squire still saves the day. So regardless of how that damage is being dealt, Selfless Squire is going to do something, which is kind of a nice upside. There's some fogs that do that, but not all of them do. And I think that we've seen like Stonehorn Dignitary, which is a similar mana cost and potentially smaller body, see some amount of play. It makes, when it enters the battlefield, it makes a player skip their next combat step. This kind of does something similar. So I think if you're blinking and have the ability to keep reusing it, I think you're on the right track there. It becomes pretty appealing. Just a 4-mana fog isn't super great on its own, but there's also some neat tricks. So I think this card is fairly reasonable, and I'm a big fan of fogs in general just because they're a good gotcha card, and this seems like a reasonable one, even though holding up 4 mana can sometimes be a little bit sketchy.
Yeah, and then there's certain decks in particular that like playing a bunch of flash creatures, don't mind holding up all their mana. One that comes to mind is Afara, God of the Polis, I believe her name is, where her entire shtick is if you had a creature enter the battlefield during that turn, it could be your turn, it could be your opponent's turns, then you get to draw a card. And it's limited to once per thing, but she loves flash creatures. She loves giving your creatures flash. She loves holding up mana for counter spells and stuff like that. So in that type of deck, Selfless Squire is really going to shine. Or, for example, Rune of the Hidden Realm, where you can, on demand, tap Rune to blink any of your creatures. Again, Selfless Squire is going to be really good there as well.
All right, so that brings us to the end of our Commander preview. So, Tomer, like every day, do you have a favorite from today's deck?
I would say Ludovic. No, not Ludovic. I think it's really the main commanders of this deck, Kynaios and Tiro, and I've ruined it again. But I think it's the best group hug commander that I've ever seen, and the one that I'm most interested in playing, just because it helps you more than it helps your opponents, and it does it in a very subtle way that I think will fly under the radar more often than not.
I gotta go with the 4-color commander as well, and that's mostly because there's not a whole lot of good options for Group Hug. Group Hug is a fairly popular commander archetype, but apart from Feldgriff, there's just not a ton of commanders that really scream out, play me in a Group Hug deck, and this is one of them, and it adds an additional color, which opens up additional options instead of Feldgriff, which is kind of the default Group Hug commander. So I'm really excited for the possibility to build a whole new style of Group Hug deck. Importantly, red being added into the picture gives you access to wheel effects, which seems pretty interesting. So I don't know. I'm excited for the possibility of building Group Hug, and I think that this is one of the best Group Hug commanders we've ever seen. So I gotta agree with you on this one, Tomer.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I've always played my first deck ever in Commander was Political Puppets, which was led by Zedrud the Great-Hearted, who actually makes an appearance in the 99 of this format, of this pre-constructed deck. So I've always really enjoyed this kind of not really group hug method where you're always gaining more than you're actually giving. And I see this as like an upgrade. I'm adding green, and I'm replacing the commander for someone that has more subtle power to it. So I'm very excited to finally give my deck a major shift.
So conspiracy theory, Tomer, Wizards included Zedrud in the 99 so players could give away the Ludwig because they knew that everyone was going to be so mad about it.
That is the best use of it. Yeah, at least you can draw cards consistently off it.
Anyway, thanks, Tomer. Thanks, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.